to invite you to reach and grab your copy of God's Word, as well as open your Cottonwood Creek app, and let's go back to the book of Joshua. We'll be in Joshua chapter 6 today, and we're going to be talking about trusting God to do the impossible. And perhaps there are some of you that when you think about your life, what's going on in your life, that you think you are facing something that is impossible for you to overcome. And so that's really what today is all about. As we look back over where we've been in this series entitled Momentum, we think back week one as we journey into a new year, that there are times that we need to remind ourselves, because of God's grace and because of God's love and because of God's power, that we need to be strong and courageous. Then that next week, we looked at Rahab and the spies, and we said this: hey, be honest about who you are. That there are times that we need to step back and take an honest spiritual evaluation. And sometimes we, like Rahab would have found out, is there are things in our life, things in our past, things that we've done that really are unworthy of being used by God. But we also said that whole week that, listen, others may disqualify you. Satan might want to convince you that God can never use you. You might even convince yourself that because of my past or because of this, that God can never use you. But I want you to know, we looked at that week that said, listen, don't ever, ever, ever disqualify yourself. Because God never disqualifies you from His grace and from His love. Last week we talked about, all right, how do I begin to put steps of faith into practice? And that's what we looked at last week. We said we can do this, we can do this, we can do this. And all of those will help move us from where we are to where God wants us to be. And today I want to talk to us about these walls of Jericho that we all have in our lives, and certainly Joshua and the children of Israel had, is that there are times in our lives when we look at an obstacle, we look at a struggle in our lives, and we think it is impossible to overcome. But the message of Joshua chapter 6 is simply this, and it should resound over and over in our minds, is that sometimes all we can do is trust God to do the impossible. You say, Pastor, when do we need to trust God to do the impossible? When it seems like the odds are against us. We all hear about odds, right? What are the odds? What is an odd? The odds that we see, it's a human measurement that kind of places a value or the chance that someone will win or lose. It is a human measurement of potential victory or potential defeat. And there are times that we feel like the odds are stacked against us, that we can't win, we can't do anything. But can I remind you that odds, when we think about them today, the impossible things that we think about today, those are nothing more than human measurements. The odds that you think are stacked against you, let me tell you what those odds don't take into account. You being strong and courageous. The odds of you winning for God, you know what they don't take into account? The steps of faith that you are taking. You know, the odds that you feel like are stacked against you, you know what they don't take into account? The fact that you've been honest with God and taken an honest spiritual evaluation. And God says, I don't disqualify you. I forgive you. I want to use you. Can I tell you that the odds don't take into account God? And so if you're sitting here today and you feel like, I am overwhelmed with the reality or the feeling that I am going to lose again in my sin and my battle and my difficulty, can I tell you, just throw all that out of the window. Because God wants to use you if you are willing to simply fight. If you're willing to be courageous, if you're willing to be disciplined, if you are willing to be deliberate, if you are willing to simply trust God. You might want to just jot this down. When we think about Jericho, if you don't know, you can go read about the archaeology of Jericho, one of the oldest, most fortified cities. It was not new in Joshua's day. It had been around a long time. It was built up on a hill. And not only was it built up on a hill, it had fortified walls against it. Now, if you know anything about military strategy, especially in those days, but even still today, typically in a military event, the person that can seize the high ground wins. How many of us know that? And so Jericho already had the advantage The children of Israel were outside looking at the walls of Jericho, and not only was it up on a hill, but then after you made it up the hill, then you had these walls. And so maybe you're outside, you're looking uphill, and then you're looking at walls that ultimately convince you in your mind that you can't be who God wants you to be. Let me just stop you right here and remind everybody in this room, everybody looking online, every victory that you want in your life will always be an uphill battle. How many of us understand that? You want to raise godly kids in this world, in this culture, in this environment? How many of you know that's an uphill battle? Man, you want to save a marriage that is on the rocks, that is destroyed. How many of you know that's an uphill battle? Maybe you're battling something physically, and man, something's going on. Maybe you've been diagnosed with cancer and you're walking through a chemo or a radiation or something. Can I remind you that's an uphill battle? You say, all right, Pastor, so you mean and I want you to know every victory that is worth having in your life and in my life, it's an uphill battle. I'm going to have to bring it each and every day as best I can with God's grace and God's power. But you say, Pastor, all right, if we understand that God can overcome anything, odds don't take into account my courage, my discipline, my persistence, nor my faith, then you say, Pastor, how come I lose so often? You might want to just write this down. Because oftentimes in the face of an uphill battle, I have downhill habits. I have downhill habits. And let me tell you what, your pastor has some downhill habits. Anybody in here have some downhill habits? That you'll come into a room like this and a day like this, and man, you mention kids, or you mention family, or you mention job, or you mention health, or you mention this, or you mention that. And man, right now, some of you are saying, man, I've got a Jericho. And I believe if God did it then, He can do it now. But then what happens? Monday brings the downhill habits, right? I don't wake up and take a step of faith. I don't wake up and spend time honestly evaluating who I am. I don't trust God. I don't demonstrate courage. I don't show persistence. So today I want to talk to you about the reality that it's a good thing to fight uphill battles. Because that's where your marriage is going to win. That's where your family's going to win. That's where your kids are going to win. That's where your church is going to win. That's where you're going to win at the office. That's going to be where you're going to win with all your friendships. But there's some things that we're going to look at today in Joshua chapter 6 that are required for us to win those uphill battles. Before I read Joshua chapter 6, and we're going to look at the story, I want to fast forward to the end of the Bible, the New Testament, a book called Hebrews. The book of Hebrews, and in Hebrews chapter 11, how many of you know, in Hebrews chapter 11, it is just a listing of all those people that did something great for God, right? It says, by faith, by faith. And so there's one verse in Hebrews chapter 11 that kind of sums up this whole battle of Jericho and how they got the victory. And so let's look at it. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30. We'll put it on the screen for you. Open it up on your app. It says, by faith. Everybody say faith. You know the message today, trust God to do the impossible. It says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 straight days. All right, so as we think about winning an uphill battle, it starts with this. If there are 2 massive columns in our spiritual journey, in our spiritual walk, the first is faith. And we see the whole Hebrews chapter 11, it is a hall of faith. It constantly says, by faith so-and-so, by faith so-and-so, by faith so-and-so. If you just read Hebrews chapter 11, it says, by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice than his brother Cain. It says, by faith, Enoch walked with God and was ultimately called up with God. It says, by faith. Everybody say, by faith. By faith, Noah built the ark and saved his family. It says, by faith, Moses delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt and led them towards the promised land. It says, by faith. How many of you noticed a theme here? By faith, the children of Israel passed through the Red Sea on dry ground, ultimately having the enemy swallowed up behind them. It says, by faith, over and over again. You know who else shows up in the Hebrew Hall of Faith? That lady named Rahab, a prostitute. It says, by faith, Rahab hid the spies. Over and over again, we just see by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. What did James, the brother of Jesus, say in the New Testament? He says, faith, though without works, is dead. See, there's not just one column that holds us up spiritually. There's a second column. That yes, we need to have faith, but that other column is called obedience. I'll submit to you, go read Hebrews chapter 11. It could just as easily be called not just the Hebrew Hall of Faith, it could be instead called the Hebrew Hall of Obedience. Because after every one of those phrases, by faith, it said they did something in obedience. By faith, Abel offered. Everybody said offered. Say offered. That's obedient. A better sacrifice than his brother Cain. It says, by faith, Enoch walked with God. What is that? Faith and obedience. By faith, Noah thought about building an ark. By faith, Noah drew up plans to build an ark. No. It says by faith, Noah what? Built an ark. It says by faith, Moses delivered the children of Israel. Notice the faith and obedience aspect. It could be the Hebrew Hall of Obedience. It says, by faith, the children of Israel walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. It says, by faith, Rahab did what? Hid the spies. By faith, Joshua overcame the walls of Jericho. So what did James, the brother of Jesus, said? Faith without works is dead. But here's the good news. It says faith with works, both, is where the victory is found. And so, child of God, I will submit that there are a lot of us journeying through life in our Christian walk that we want to grow our faith, grow our faith, grow our faith, grow our faith. And the main way we need to be reminded, the way you grow your faith is by walking in obedience. Do we understand that? So if you are trusting God to do something impossible in your life, what we're going to see in Jericho today is that God spoke to Joshua, gave him clear commands, and Joshua obeyed. And that's the key. I love what Paul said in the New Testament. You think about your struggle, your battle. He says, man, the weapons of our warfare are not physical. They're not weapons of the military. They're instead spiritual. So you and I, as we journey through and we battle and we fight our battles, we have to remember that the battle that we fight is not simply a physical battle. It is a spiritual one. And we need to say, God, use me. All right, so as we go, let's start reading Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. Let's just go to verse 1. Let me just start it right there. Notice what it says. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. So here we are. The walls of Jericho are already uphill. Now they have large walls. They are secure. And if you look archaeologically, you can go read it. They could have survived. It had a spring going up in there. They could have survived from a several year siege. And so what it says is the children of Israel had crossed over into the Jordan River. The king and the leader of Jericho said, listen, let's close up the gates. There is no way that they can fight this uphill battle and then come overthrow these walls. We will be fine. I think it's kind of interesting as I was just reflecting this week on this story. There are two groups of people in this story. And maybe you identify with one group or the other. The first group of people is the people of Jericho. That they went into their walled cities, they closed the gate, and that Hebrew word says they secured it tightly. Now notice, what did the people of Jericho trust in? Those walls that will ultimately come tumbling down. My big fear for some in this room is that you're trusting in the wrong thing. You have walled yourself up from other people and enemies, and you are flat out trusting in the wrong thing. And I don't know what those things are. But there's a second group, that's the children of Israel outside. It's probably interesting that the people in the wall, Jericho, they completely trusted the walls. The children of Israel probably were filled with amazing doubt. How many of you understand that? They're sitting there going, wait, we're going to have to fight, first of all, uphill to this city, and then if we somehow survive to make it to the walls, then we've got to scale the walls. That's not a recipe for victory. And so it's kind of interesting. The people in Jericho probably had a good bit of trust that the walls and the fact that the Jericho was built on a hill, they were going to be fine. And the people of God outside probably were filled with incredible doubt. And so maybe you're in one of those spaces or one of those places today. Here's my question. What are your walls? What are the Jerichos in your life? So I was just reading some articles and some studies. What do people just constantly find themselves filled with fear about? They're worried that they're going to fail. They're going to struggle. Man, sometimes it's a health problem. And you just think, man, I'm not going to win this battle. I'm not going to overcome this. Sometimes it's some sort of work situation that, man, when you think back on where you were and how you thought your career was going to turn out or what you thought you were going to do, and then you look at what you're actually doing, you just kind of feel like a failure, and you're like, man, am I ever going to overcome? Am I ever going to be who I really want to be at the office? Maybe there's some here that the wall that you're struggling with is a habitual sin. That, man, you've overcome it before, some addiction that you've overcome before, but it seems like all of a sudden somehow those walls keep getting rebuilt and you find yourself struggling and losing again, and maybe that's your Jericho. I was reading a sad statistic that there are a lot of people that they just, where they are in their life and in their relationships and their occupation, they just feel hopeless. That they're just filled with an emptiness in their life, that they can't see meaning. Can I tell you, that is a wall? That's your Jericho, maybe, or someone you love, that's their Jericho. And what we really need to do, whether it's a sin, whether it's our job, whether it's our health, whether it's our relationships, and we need to trust God to do the impossible. I was reading a number of people that I just kind of equated it to their Jericho. There are some people here perhaps today or are viewing online that you are just filled with unforgiveness. And by the way, I'm not discounting the hurt. The hurt is real. There are perhaps some in this room or some looking online that someone hurt you in the past. And you just struggle with forgiving them. And that's your Jericho. To just never forget about it, but to let it go so it doesn't destroy your future. And if you aren't careful, the writer of the book of Hebrews said this: be careful that unforgiveness doesn't take root in your heart, because once we have a heart of unforgiveness, then it'll become a bitter and angry heart. And that bitterness and anger will cause a root to grow down of bitterness in our heart. And notice what it says, and defile many. So maybe there's someone here today, it's a heart of unforgiveness and bitterness that someone has wronged you. But notice the pattern. If you don't learn to forgive or at least deal with it, you develop a bitter heart, and you can hurt the people around you who had nothing to do with that original hurt. And that's why the writer of the book of Hebrews said, and it will defile many. So I don't know what your Jericho is. I can tell you, your pastor has some Jerichos. Anybody in here think of a Jericho or two? Anybody in here that because of your past, you're hiding behind some walls you've built, but you know they won't last, but you're still trusting those walls? Man, I pray that today as we think about winning the victory against Jericho, let me just kind of give you some steps. I'm just going to walk you through Joshua chapter 6. This isn't going to be rocket science, but it's important for us to know if we're going to trust God. Here's number one. It just starts with the title. Trust God to do the impossible. From an earthly perspective, the children of Israel, they weren't prepared for this battle. For 40 years prior to this, they were simply nomads marching around in the desert, watching a generation of unfaithful people die off. You say, okay, but before that, they were slaves. They were not ready to fight Jericho. They were not ready to fight an uphill battle. They were not ready to scale the walls. But notice what it says. They were willing, led by Joshua, to trust God to do the impossible. Pick it up in verse 2. It says, then the Lord said, man, that's what we want to hear. When it relates to your Jericho today, I want you to invite God. God, speak to me. Tell me what you want to do. So it says, here's what the Lord said to Joshua. See, I have delivered. This is God promising him victory. Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. Look at verse 3. So here's your plan. Here's what you got to do. He says, march around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Everybody say 6 days. Do this for 6 different days. Then verse 4, have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times. There's an importance in 7 here. All right? On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. Now just stop there. My guess is when Joshua went back to the people, and they go, all right, how are we going to do it? And Joshua says, we're going to walk around it. If I would have been there, I want you to know I'd have said, we've had 40 years to plan this. And that's the best we can come up with, right? So we're just going to walk around. Oh, no, that's not all. We're going to have some warriors up front. Then we're going to have some trumpets. We're going to have some fighters in the back. But right in the middle is going to be the ark. And that does tell us, you see the imagery right here. He is saying around everything, God is at the center of everything that we do. And so, child of God, if you and I are going to move out with God and overcome our Jericho, it starts by putting God right in the middle of everything. In my conversations, in my relationships, with my finances, in my prayers, in my study of God's Word. It starts with God being right there in the middle. Now, it's interesting. He says for 6 days you're going to do one thing, and on the 7th day you're going to do something else. That word 7, how many of you know 7's a little important in the Bible? It means completion or perfection. You look in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, that is the first chapter in the Bible. That is the first time we see the word 7. It says, on the 7th day, God completed, perfected, finished his creation, and rested. Kind of the challenge for us is the Sabbath, the worship, to ultimately understand 7 means the number of completion. If you go to Revelation at the end of the Bible, the last book in the Bible, man, you will see Jesus journeying through the churches. How many churches were there? 7 churches representing all the churches. He has 7 stars with 7 angels. Go a little further. There are 7 trumpets. There are 7 seals. There are 7 judgments. 7 is important. Of completion and perfection. Man, that word 7 is used over 700 times in the Bible. Now, we don't want to dive into too much numerology, but really, when God puts something together like this, He says, whatever you do, don't come up short. Finish the task. And my guess is there are some of you today that like me, I'm telling you, like me, that there are some Jerichos in your life that you've almost overcome. Today's message said completely overcome it. There's some things in your life that you're like, man, I'm so close. Or I've started. I've been faithful day 1, day 2. 7's important. Man, when the children of Israel, before they ever got into the promised land, before the temple was built, when God put together the tabernacle, He put together the lampstand. There were 7 lights, candles, stems on the lampstand. Man, 7 is powerful. If you go to the book of John, how many I ams did Jesus give? 7. Saying, I am the completeness of God and His gift to you. Remember when Peter said, Lord, let's say that someone offends me. How many times should I forgive them? 7? Remember what Jesus responded? No, how about a multiple of that? And so when we come to this idea of 7, this means that you and I, when we attack Jericho, we don't stop until we've fully completed God's plan and fully gained the victory. So as you think about this, man, we just want to hear from God and we want to trust Him to do the impossible. Here's number 2. Obey God's plan. So faith and obedience right here. Look at verse 9. It says, so here's what Joshua and the people did. It says the armed guard marched ahead of the priest. There it is, the armed guard protecting the ark, protecting the priest. They blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time, the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the army, do not give a cry or a war cry. Do not raise your voices, and do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, and then shout. So here it is. They believe somehow, some way, this plan is going to overthrow Jericho. There's no doubt there were some doubters in the room. I would have been a doubter. Okay, let's say that we actually get into the city, then what? But notice the big key was that they obeyed. That every day they woke up, they walked around one time, they came back to their camp and they stopped. The next day they walked around one time, they came back to their camp and stopped. The next day they did it over and over again. So thought number 1, have faith, trust God to do the impossible. Thought number 2 is obey God's plan. And we talked last week about taking steps of faith. Man, just stay plugged in and stay faithful on day 1, on day 2, on day 3. Here's the third thought. Don't give up. Everybody say, don't give up. You say, where do you see that? Let's read it. It says, Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priest took the ark. It says, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets, there's the word 7 a lot, then go to completion, went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. It says, the armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. Look at verse 14. So on the second day, what did they do? They marched around the city once and returned to the camp. Then they did this for 6 days. March around, come back to the camp. March around, come back to the camp. March around, come back to the camp. Very important. Do you see anywhere in there where the men just kind of said, oh, did you see the crack? Did you see when we were marching around some mortar fell out? No. It kind of seems to say nothing happened. Here's the encouragement for us, people of God. A lot of times we get discouraged because we're just walking in obedience and we're following God's plan and we don't see anything happening. And what happens is we get discouraged and we give up. It doesn't say when they marched around, the children of Israel noticed a crack. It doesn't say on day 2 they begin to see the mortar fall out and a few stones fall out. There was nothing to give them hope that these marches around the wall were going to do anything. But notice what it says. They did it day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and day 6. How many of you know throughout Scripture, not only is the word 7 used over 700 times, but there are oftentimes multiples of 7, right? How many times you forgive? 7 times 70. How many times did David say he talked 70 weeks? There are some of you that, man, I wish it was easy enough. That somehow, some way that our Jerichos could fall in the next 6 days. How many of you wish you could overwhelm and defeat all your Jerichos in the next 6 days? See, but here's the reality. Some of us, it'll be 6 weeks. Sometimes it will take 6 months. Sometimes it might be 6 years before that prodigal comes home. What's the key? Once God gives you the plan and you trust Him, you obey it until you get the victory over your Jericho. It would have been real easy for them to stop after day 2 or after day 3 or after day 4. Some of you in this room, I truly believe, man, you've been working on this marriage to try to save this marriage. And some of y'all are doing the right thing and you're about to quit after day 3. When God is simply saying, obey me and follow the plan. Man, don't ever, ever, ever give up. It's easy. Man, we all want to give up at some point. And I can imagine the children of Israel wanted to give up as well. But it says they did this for 6 days. Man, once you know God's plan, you believe God can do it, just hang in there and stay in there. Here's number 4, look at it. Then ultimately, when we go all the way to completion, we will experience the victory. All right? It may not look like we thought it would look, and it may not happen exactly when we thought it would happen, but we will experience, if we live with faith and obedience, we will find the victory. Look at it in verse 15. It says, on the 7th day, everybody say the 7th day. For you, it might be the 7th week, it might be the 7th month, it might be the 7th year, it might be the 70th year. He says, on the 7th day, they got up at daybreak. They marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except for on that day, they cried out, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua then commanded the army, shout, for the Lord your God has given you this city. Look at verse 20, jump down. It says, when the trumpet sounded, the army shouted. And at that sound of the trumpet, then the men gave a loud shout, and the wall collapsed, so everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. So here it is. Do this day 1, do this day 2, do this day 3, do this day 4, do this day 5, do this day 6, show up day 7, being faithful to God and obedient to God. And I'll promise you, you look at God's word from Genesis to Revelation, God will show up for you. But I believe too many times, I think in my life, I've stopped on day 3. I've stopped on day 5. I look back on things in my life from time to time, I say, man, I stopped on day 6. I want to encourage us, faith and obedience follows through, and you will experience the victory. Now, here's the next thing I want to see, number 5. When God gives you the victory over your Jericho, then you start looking out for other people. You start looking out for other people. Just jot down. They just experienced the victory in verse 20 and 21. Here in verse 22, notice what Joshua said to the 2 men. These are the spies that had gone in, who had spied out the land. Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. Let me just stop you here. If you go look in the original Hebrew, I just pulled out one verse. This is how important it is for us when we experience the victory God has given us, that we try to share that victory with somebody else. If you go look in the original Hebrew language, There are almost as many words devoted to the salvation of Rahab in this story as there are the victory over Jericho. Now think about this. This verse, I just read one of the verses. Go read it all. This verse was not a throw-in. Oh, by the way, take care of Rahab. No. Joshua makes it a big deal. But because she protected and she did this and she had faith in God and she believed and she did this. Therefore, we need to understand when God gives us the victory, it's a big deal for us to then turn around and care for other people. What did Jesus say? He said, the Son of Man, talking about himself, came to seek and to save the lost. Child of God, if God gives you the victory over something in your life, you turn right around and use your victory to demonstrate God's love for other people. And then here's number 6. You ready? Don't rebuild the walls. Man, once you get victory over Jericho, don't rebuild the walls. Hey, let's be honest. How many of you in here that you can look back on your life that there was something that you knew you needed to overcome and God enabled you to overcome it and you beat it for a week or a month or a year and then all of a sudden it came back? Let's be honest. Okay, there's 3. Hey, we've all been there. Maybe it's bitterness, maybe it's anger, maybe it's this, something I said, maybe it's an addiction. That I've had those seasons of victory, but somehow, some way, I started rebuilding those walls. I love what Joshua does here. He delivers a curse. And he says, I am not going back. When God gives you the victory, make that decision in your life. You are not going back. You say, where do you see that? Pick it up in verse 24. It says, then they burned the whole city and everything in it. They put the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord, but they burned everything else. Look at verse 26. At that time, Joshua pronounced a solemn oath, a curse. He says, cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild the city of Jericho. Now, let me stop you there. So they trusted God. They obeyed the plan. All right, they didn't give up. They ultimately experienced the victory. Once they experienced the victory, they cared about others, wanted others to come with them, and then they cursed the walls of Jericho. I am never, ever, ever going back. You say, Pastor, that's kind of a hard thing. He cursed the walls of Jericho and anyone that rebuilt them. And you might say, Pastor, is there anyone that tried to rebuild those walls? Yeah. Anybody remember the story of Queen Jezebel? How'd that turn out for her? Ahab and Jezebel tried to rebuild the walls. And the curse came down on them. So, child of God, here's the thing. Once you trust God, you get the plan, you obey the plan, you don't give up, you experience the victory, you share your victory over a certain thing with someone else, then you tear down the walls completely so that you can never go back. That's when victory happens. And it can start today. Are you willing to circle your city once on day 1, week 1, year 1, day 2, week 2, year 3, day 3? Are you willing to just faithfully follow God in obedience? This story tells us if we will, the walls will come down.